Before we get any farther in this video, we have to talk about pricing because these two GPUs do not cost the same amount of money. And there's also a big difference between MSRP and the prices currently in the market because it's looking like AMD's 7900 XT has just dropped price. At least for now, hopefully permanently, and actually I'm hoping that it might go a bit further, but some more thoughts on that at the end of today's video. But what actually is the current pricing? What am I talking about here? So first of all, we're seeing reports that AMD drops RX 7900 XT price to $749 officially for some at least promotional period while NVIDIA launches all of these new GPUs. In other words, a reaction to steal a bit of their thunder. But great for the consumer, right? That's why we want competition, bring pricing down. And we're seeing reports that some models are already down to $709.99, which I can confirm. If I search for a 7900 XT on like PC Part Picker, for example, you can see there are several models available at $710, and then some of, I see one at $720, and then at least one at $750. By the way, the model I'm testing in this video is the Power Color Hellhound. Now, so that's the current pricing for the 7900 XT. Now we've had the 4070 Super, which I'm comparing it against in this video, which is a $600 MSRP, and it is still available at that price now a few days after launch. So it looks like that is realistically available, and then some better, cooler models available a bit above that. So it's important when watching benchmarks and looking at the relative performance difference that it's not always as simple as which GPU is faster when one also costs more money, right? So if we look at the a little bit of that right here at the start, if we look at the cheapest 7900 XT, which is $710, and divide it by the cheapest 4070 Super, there we go, we get a 18% price increase. So basically, if you choose to buy the 7900 XT over the 4070 Super, if we're comparing cheapest models, you are choosing to spend 18% more money. So we would have to see 18% win for the 7900 XT to be offering equal value. So from a value perspective. So, but again, not everybody's just looking at value. There's also just the question of which GPU is better, which one would you rather have. That'll also get muddled by, are we ray tracing or not? Because, you know, games like Avatar Frontiers of Pandora are ray tracing only, despite being an AMD sponsored title. And then there's games starting to push ray tracing to crazy levels like Alan Wake 2. But is the 4070 Super, you know, strong enough to take advantage of that? So how does that stack up when you go into the ray tracing modes, things like that? So we'll look at all of that in this video, and I'll get you some final thoughts at the end. Oh, and one more thing about video playback smoothness. You shouldn't be using that to judge smoothness. You should be looking at the frame time graphs. I've noticed a lot of people miss the little disclaimer I do at the beginning with the important note that when you film video at 60 frames per second, but the games aren't running at 60 frames per second, that can introduce motion judder and choppiness and screen tearing, which you wouldn't see in person on a variable refresh rate display. So you should be judging smoothness based on frame time graphs and 1% lows rather than the visual appearance of the footage. Let's hop into the benchmarks. All right, we'll start out with Avatar Frontiers of Pandora. I think it's possibly the best looking game out there, other than perhaps Alan Wake 2, and it is a ray tracing only title, despite being an AMD sponsored title. And because NVIDIA generally does have better ray tracing performance, I think that explains why we're seeing the less expensive 4070 Super matching the performance of the 7900 XT here at 1080p Ultra. However, as we move up to 1440p resolution, we are now seeing the 7900 XT take a lead, despite this being a ray tracing title. At 68 versus 62, it is 10% faster in the averages and 8% better in the 1% lows at 57 versus 53. And it's possible that the 12 gigabytes of VRAM on the 4070 Super could be, well, we're right on that borderline here. So it's definitely something to keep in mind. And it's also interesting that if we kick on DLSS or FSR at the quality settings, that we now reach a tie again with overall frame rate numbers very good at 95 frames per second. Now, despite this being a tie in performance, the image quality of DLSS versus FSR is not the same. And I think if you look at the fine details in the fencing and the base back here, you can tell that the FSR image is a little bit less solidly reconstructed. Now, this game is one of the ones featuring FSR 3 frame generation. It doesn't have DLSS 3 frame generation, so if you want to use frame generation, you have to go the FSR pipeline on both GPUs, which they can both do, and doing that can, you can definitely at least lock out to 120. Now, I can't go past that because apparently the game enables VSync, and my capture card here tops out at 120. Anyway, so just showing that that's an option. Now, if we move to high settings instead of ultra settings, at 1440p, we are seeing the 7900 XT with a 10% advantage over the 4070 Super at 88 versus 80. So if you want to play without upscaling, I think this would be a pretty good option, especially for a first-person shooter. I prefer to be around that kind of 80 to 90 FPS range. Again, we're seeing that 10% lead for the 7900 XT. However, you can enable DLSS or FSR at the quality setting on top of dropping down to the high settings, and now we're seeing 115 frames per second average on both GPUs with 1% lows at 90 and 91 respectively. So again, kicking on the upscaling does close the performance gap, and I would give the image quality edge to DLSS here. This is a pretty good FSR implementation, but I think again, those fine details are a bit more stable on the DLSS image. Now, what about 4K resolution? I think here it's more likely that we are spilling over 12 gigabytes of VRAM, causing the 7900 XT to take an 18% advantage at 39 versus 33, while the 4070 Super has to reach a little bit into system memory. It's possible that's not the only reason or isn't the reason, but if you look at the VRAM allocation on the 7900 XT, that makes sense. However, I don't think that's the way either GPU would want to play the game. You would want to turn down settings and or upscale, since the frame rate numbers were pretty low, especially for a first-person shooter. So if you kick on DLSS or FSR quality, we're seeing 55 versus 59 FPS, so the gap has now closed to a 7% lead for the 7900 XT, and they're both very, very, very playable now. Although again, slight image quality edge to DLSS here, although it's much closer at the 4K resolution than at 1440p. Now, if we drop down to high settings rather than upscaling, the 4070 Super can hit 45 FPS and the 7900 XT hits 50. So definitely playable here, although I think a bit lower than people would actually want to be in a first-person shooter. And we're seeing an 11% lead for the 7900 XT and a 12% lead in the 1% lows at 46 versus 41. So I think really the way you might want to play from a frame rate perspective would be drop to the high settings and kick on DLSS or FSR at the quality setting, in which case the performance now is a slight win for the 7900 XT, although, not too noticeable. 73 versus 70 FPS in the averages and 62 versus 59 in the 1% lows, so 4% and 5% there. And both GPUs extremely playable here at some very good settings. And again, at 4K resolution, small image quality edge to DLSS, but nothing major. Now let's look at Alan Wake 2, and starting out at 1080p high, we don't have ray tracing enabled. This game doesn't offer a native TAA pathway. It forces you into DLSS or FSR pathways, which is interesting. And I do think the DLAA pathway does look a little bit more stable. I see a little bit more sparkling in motion and on tree branches and things with the FSR pathway, but both look pretty good. And it was a pretty big lead for the 7900 XT, and 1440p resolution is where I think we'd be more likely to be targeting these GPUs. And here I'm seeing a 25% advantage for the 7900 XT at 75 versus 60. In a slower paced game like this, I think this is a perfectly acceptable way to play the game. We're seeing a 16% advantage in the 1% lows, so a smaller lead there. And you could enable upscaling to get a much higher frame rate experience if you prefer, in which case we're seeing 114 FPS versus 90, so a 27% lead for the 7900 XT, and only a 10% lead in the 1% lows. This is a game that has DLSS 3 frame generation, and we are at a high enough base frame rate here that I think kicking that on does work pretty well, as long as you turn off motion blur in this game. I find that that doesn't play well with the frame generation. In Alan Wake 2 at 4K high settings, neither GPU is doing great, but the 7900 XT is more playable in the averages. But look at its frame time graph. It's spiking all over the place. And for some reason, I'm seeing this in this test area on multiple AMD GPUs after restarts and driver reinstalls. So I'm not quite sure what's causing that at this resolution, but it gives the 1% lows advantage to the 4070 Super. And neither GPU was doing great there, so if you kick on quality level upscaling, we're now seeing the 7900 XT hit 69, nice, which is a 25% lead over the 4070 Super, but the frame time graph is still a lot spikier, which is actually giving a lead in the 1% lows by 18% to the 4070 Super. So, you know, I think the 1% lows are kind of a big deal for your overall smoothness there. Now, what if we wanted to try out the path tracing mode? Well, the 4070 Super can hit 39 FPS at 1080p with the ray tracing settings maxed out. However, you know, the 7900 XT only hits 24 FPS. That's a 63% advantage to the 4070 Super and 88% in the 1% lows, but I think that's still kind of underwhelming performance from the 4070 Super. So if you enable quality level upscaling, which I don't really like to do at 1080p, although the ray reconstruction on DLSS here does help the stability a bit, the 4070 Super can now hit 60 FPS and the 7900 XT is now playable at 41. But that is a 46% advantage to the 4070 Super and a 61% advantage in the 1% lows. If you look at the frame time graphs, it's a lot smoother on the 4070 Super. What if we move up to 1440p resolution, which I think is most relevant? Then now, even with FSR and DLSS quality enabled, they're not doing especially well. The 4070 Super is playable in a low, this game's not super fast-paced or anything. It's 43 FPS. It is a 59% win over the 7900 XT, but I'm not convinced this is how I'd want to play it. Even a bigger lead in the 1% lows, which are getting very spiky on the 7900 XT. You could go all the way down to performance mode upscaling, which is an internal resolution of 720p, and I do think the upscale looks significantly better on the DLSS side, but that doesn't mean it looks good. I still think you're losing a lot of detail in the tree branches and things like that, although performance numbers are now hitting 57, which gives you a decent baseline to frame generate off of, and a 43% lead over the 7900 XT overall there. If you move up to 4K resolution, even with performance mode upscaling, it's not a great experience on either GPU. The 4070 Super takes a 39% win, but I just don't think these are realistic settings you'd want to use at 32 frames per second. And that's not really a great baseline to generate frames off of. You can see that with frame generation enabled, we're well over 100 milliseconds of PC latency, and that's without even factoring in the display. That's just the software reported latency. Anyway, the other game we can look at the path tracing mode in to see if that's a selling point, is Cyberpunk. And at 1080p resolution without upscaling, the 4070 Super is hitting 40 FPS in the built-in benchmark, and 7900 XT is hitting 27. Neither of them are great, but the 4070 Super, I would argue, is at least a way you could play the game. It's 48% lead, but I don't think it's a way you would play the game. You could enable quality level upscaling, and now the 4070 Super, frame rate wise, is doing very well. 76 FPS, which you could then generate frames off of to smooth things out. So you just really have to decide, is the upscaling at 1080p worth it to you? The palm tree branches don't look super stable. And now we're taking a 58% lead over the 7900 XT, which is in itself actually playable now at 48 frames per second, although I didn't think the FSR upscale looked as good, especially at those lower resolutions. Now, at 1440p with quality level upscaling enabled, the 4070 can hit 51 frames per second without frame generation, giving it a 59% lead over the 32 FPS on the 7900 XT. And the generating frames off of this base frame rate is going to be, some people like it, some people won't, depending on how sensitive to latency and things like that you are. You can go down to performance mode upscaling to now hit 73 FPS on the 4070 Super, giving it a 52% advantage over the 7900 XT at 48, and a much better image quality over the, I think, the performance mode upscaling on FSR. However, that doesn't mean it looks good. Again, things like the palm tree branches are very, very shaky here, and personally, this is pushing upscaling a bit farther than I would choose to do myself. So what about 4K resolution? Well, it's, at performance mode upscaling, you can hit 39 FPS average on the 4070 Super. You can try to generate frames off of that, although it's a lot lower than I would want to do for frame generation. Anyway, even without frame generation, it is a 50% lead for the 4070 Super over the 26 FPS on the 7900 XT, and the DLSS upscale does look noticeably sharper, but I don't think you're hitting the frame rate numbers that are too relevant here. And just a reminder that you could also just play the game without, path tracing and all that. And if we stick to the non-ray traced ultra settings at 4K resolution, we're now seeing the 7900 XT take a 39% lead over the 4070 Super at 53 FPS versus 38, and a 43% lead in the 1% lows. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that those were the settings you'd want to play at, because they were kind of low for both. If we drop down to 1440p, we're now seeing still a 39% lead for the 7900 XT, hitting 118 FPS versus 85 on the 4070 Super, and a 38% lead in the 1% lows at 90 versus 65. So if you're going to be playing Cyberpunk without ray tracing, it certainly looks like the 7900 XT delivers a significantly better experience. But what about Baldur's Gate 3 at 1080p ultra resolution? Both GPUs are offering such high performance that we end up CPU limited despite my CPU being a 7800X 3D. Now this is in Baldur's Gate City in Act 3, where you do get a lot more, NPCs causing CPU limitations, and the overall performance is 120 frames per second. We see a 6% lead in the 1% lows for the 7900 XT, which could be related to driver overhead differences between AMD and NVIDIA, where AMD can sometimes perform a bit better in CPU limited situations. Anyway, the 7900 XT is able to pull slightly ahead at 1440p, but I think it's still mostly CPU limited here, given our frame rate numbers are so close to what we saw at 1080p. Although the 1% lows are now showing a 15% advantage for the 7900 XT. If we move up to 4K resolution, we're not so CPU limited, and we see a 28% lead in the averages at 88 versus 69. Nice on the 4070 Super. However, now the 1% lows are taking advantage for the 4070 Super at 60 versus 52, and the AMD frametime graph now has tiny little spikes at regular intervals. And this is interesting because I've seen this in other AMD GPUs, specifically at 4K Ultra in this game, but not at the other resolutions, and it is repeatable, so interesting. Anyway, at Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, I'm going to choose to test the basic preset, since it's one of the lowest presets, and I think that's how people tend to use competitive multiplayer games. We're seeing over 300 FPS on both GPUs. It's 347 versus 317 in the averages, so a 9% lead for the 7900 XT, and they're basically tied in the 1% lows, although it's technically a 3% lead for the 4070 Super. We're probably starting to see a bit of CPU limitation at that lower resolution and settings. At 1440p, we're again still at basic settings. Both GPUs again doing great. We're seeing 283 FPS versus 236, so we're allowing the 7900 XT to kind of stretch its headroom a bit here beyond CPU limitations. Or maybe it's not just CPU limitations, but it does better at 1440p relatively, with a 20% lead, and the 1% lows are now a 26% lead over the 4070 Super. If we move up to 4K resolution, the advantage stretches to 29% in the averages at 178 versus 138, and 41% in the 1% lows at 117 versus 83. So it's looking like, depending on the resolution you're playing at here, it can make a pretty big difference between the two GPUs going from a tie to a win to a pretty big win, right, at 4K. Let's move on to Starfield, which at 1080p Ultra gives a 26% advantage to the 7900 XT at 107 versus 85, and a 25% lead in the 1% lows at 75 versus 60. This game did, when it first launched, offer a lot better AMD performance relative to NVIDIA, but some patches and driver updates have brought NVIDIA further than they were when the game initially launched, and this is totally updated testing. In 1440p Ultra, we're seeing the 7900 XT take a 28% advantage over the 4070 Super at 88 versus 69. Nice. And the 1% lows are 69 versus 50. 50, which is a 38% advantage for the 7900 XT, and both GPUs are doing so well here that you might just play at the native ultra settings. However, the game was updated to have DLSS as well as frame generation. No FSR3 frame generation yet, although I think that was mentioned in a future patch note. And at these settings, we're seeing, I'd say, small image quality advantage for DLSS and a 20% frame rate advantage for the 7900 XT at 102 versus 85, and an 8% advantage in the 1% lows. We're high enough frame rate numbers here that I think enabling frame generation can also make sense. If we move up to 4K Ultra, we're now seeing a 41% advantage for the 7900 XT at 58 versus 41, and a 48% advantage in the 1% lows at 49 versus 33. So this is a case where I think if you wanted to play without upscaling and not turning down any settings, the performance advantage here is so noticeable that the 7900 XT could definitely do that. However, it looks like turning on DLSS and FSR at the quality level of upscaling, which at 4K resolution I think is often a good choice from an optimization standpoint. You get a lot more performance without too big of a visual quality hit upscaling at this resolution. We're now seeing the lead back to 28% at 77 versus 60, and 58 versus 48 in the 1% lows. Now that the 4070 Super is hitting 60, I think that's a decent baseline to frame generate off of. And let's move on to Resident Evil 4 Remake to test out Capcom's RE engine. Here at 1080p max settings, which does include ray tracing, we are seeing basically a tie. We're seeing a 5% advantage for the 7900 XT, although a more noticeable 13% advantage in the 1% lows, but both GPUs are doing extremely well here at basically 150 FPS. If we move up to 1440p resolution and stay at the max settings, we're now seeing a 14% advantage for the 7900 XT at 129 versus 113, and a 16% advantage in the 1% lows. Now, both GPUs are doing great here, but if you look at VRAM allocation on the 7900 XT, it's possible that the 4070 Super might be having to slow down a bit accessing system memory, and that could be happening even more at 4K resolution, where we see a lot of VRAM allocated on the 7900 XT, and we're seeing a 26% advantage now. Now, both GPUs are still performing well, so even if the 4070 Super is having to go into system RAM, it's not destroying its performance. We're at 83 versus 66 here in the averages, and 73 versus 58 in the 1% lows. So definitely a noticeable win there for the 7900 XT. So I was also curious, what if we went down to the prioritized graphics preset at 4K resolution, which does not include ray tracing and reins in the VRAM considerably? We are now seeing a 32% win for the 7900 XT, but keep in mind there's no ray tracing now. And it's 103 FPS versus 78. And the 1% lows are 93 versus 69, nice, which is a 35% lead for the 7900 XT. Let's move on to some Unreal Engine 5 games. Lords of the Fallen is the most demanding one I've tested. It's also the most NVIDIA advantaged one I've tested. When I've looked at this between a bunch of AMD and NVIDIA GPUs. At 1080p Ultra, we're seeing 74 and 76 FPS respectively, and the 1% lows are tied at 51. The 1% lows are, I think, mostly tied to traversal stutters in the engine in this game, so anyway, just keep that in mind. At 1440p Ultra, we're seeing 56 versus 53, which is a 6% lead for the 7900 XT. And the 1% lows are 41 versus 39. Again, as you kind of round this corner here, you'll see some spikes on the frame time graphs, and I think that's as it's loading into this new section, and that's not too relevant to the GPUs themselves. That's more of an engine thing with the traversal stutters. So anyway, if we enable quality level upscaling, we see a massive performance boost, and this is the case across the board in every Unreal Engine 5 game I've tested. It seems like the engine is just designed with upscaling in mind. And now our GPUs are hitting 83 and 80 FPS respectively. And so it's still basically a tie performance-wise, although I would say, again, small image quality edge to DLSS in this game, especially in motion, as objects are disoccluded. And if we move up to 4K resolution, neither GPU does great at the native ultra settings, although it does give a 10% advantage to the 7900 XT. but that's 32 versus 29 FPS. The 1% lows are an 8% advantage, but that's 26 versus 24. So I just don't think that that's realistically the settings you would use on either GPU. And just by enabling quality level upscaling, our performance jumps all the way from basically 30 to now 52 FPS. So you can see what I mean about Unreal Engine responding so strongly to upscaling from a performance standpoint. So now everything's very, very playable here, although certainly you could choose to turn things down further. And the GPU's again tied at 52 FPS. The 1% lows do show a 10% advantage to the 4070 Super, but again, I think it's really more traversal stutter related than anything 2 GPU related. Now, if we move on to a different Unreal Engine 5 game, you'll see that performance numbers overall are higher in RoboCop, and it's not as NVIDIA advantaged, so AMD is actually taking a more noticeable lead here with the 17% lead over the 4070 Super at 116 versus 99 FPS at 1080p EPIC settings. The 1% lows are also a 17% advantage at 89 versus 76. If we move up to 1440p resolution, which is I think the most relevant one for these GPUs, we're seeing 81 versus 69 FPS, which is a 17% advantage for the 7900 XT again, and an 18% advantage in the 1% lows at 67 versus 57. Now, this is certainly high enough frame rates, especially on the 7900 XT, that you don't necessarily need to upscale or turn down settings. However, we've seen Unreal Engine respond so well to those the upscaling performance-wise that if we do kick it on, we see frame rates jump all the way to 99 and 115 respectively. 16% advantage performance-wise for the 7900 XT, but I really don't like the look of FSR upscaling in this game. The street looks very sparkly, the grills on the cars look very unstable, the fencing in the background looks very unstable. Anyway, so not a huge fan of the FSR implementation here. At 4K EPIC settings, we're hitting 37 and 41 FPS respectively, so probably not the settings you would use to play this game at 4K resolution. You would likely either turn down settings or upscale or both. And this being Unreal Engine 5, where we have established that the upscaling performance uplift is quite large, that's what I'm going to test out here. So if we kick on upscaling at the quality setting, the GPUs jump massively, and we're now seeing 58 versus 66 FPS respectively, which is a 14% performance advantage for the 7900 XT. Although image quality-wise, again, even at 4K resolution, where I do think the FSR upscale is better looking than it was at 1440p, I still see a lot of instability in the fencing. The street looks kind of sparkly, so don't love that. Let's look at one more Unreal Engine 5 game. And while I said, Lords of the Fallen tended to be a bit more NVIDIA-sided, Immortals of Aveum in most of my testing has tended to be a bit more AMD-sided. At 1080p Ultra, I'm seeing 108 FPS versus 94, which is a 15% advantage for the 7900 XT, and 80 versus 66 in the 1% lows, giving it a bigger 21% advantage. If we move up to 1440p resolution, which I think is the most relevant, we're seeing 80 FPS versus 66, so 21% advantage for the 7900 XT, and high enough performance, especially on the 7900 XT, that you might choose just not to upscale. Just play at the native resolution ultra settings and enjoy it. However, again, this is Unreal Engine 5, so upscaling can provide a very large performance boost, and if we do enable it at the quality setting, we're seeing 108 versus 98 without frame generation. Now this is one of, I think, still the only, or one of the only games that features both DLSS 3 and FSR 3 frame generation, so I'm also showing results using those. They work very differently in this game. I think for the FSR 3 frame generation in this game, you definitely want to enable VSync to your monitor's max refresh rate, which I'm obviously not going to do in a performance comparison like we're doing here. But anyway, if we move up to 4K resolution, we're seeing a 26% lead for the 7900 XT in the averages, and a much more noticeable 48% lead in the 1% lows, although I think this is just a bit academic since these aren't really the settings I think people would use, given the overall frame rate numbers are just 43 and 34 respectively. Certainly a lot more playable on the 7900 XT, but maybe not the numbers we're looking for. And if we enable quality level upscaling, performance jumps significantly to 60 and 67 respectively. And that does give a 12% lead now to the 7900 XT and a 30% lead in the 1% lows. And again, with a 60 FPS baseline, enabling frame generation is not a terrible idea, and you can see those results as well. This one's a tough call, guys, because again, the GPUs don't cost the same. So I do think the 7900 XT is the better all-around GPU in a wider variety of situations. In ray tracing situations, it can tie or beat the performance of the 4070 Super unless we're talking extremely demanding ray tracing situations. Again, Avatar Frontiers of Pandora here is a ray tracing title, and it is a very good looking one. This isn't one of those titles where you're like, the ray tracing is meaningless. This is a ray tracing only title. Meaning at all graphic settings, it does use some amount of ray tracing and has a software ray tracing fallback for non-ray tracing hardware. But anyway, you know, it can do well at ray tracing. We are seeing places where the VRAM is really borderline on that 12, and having the 20 gigabytes of VRAM is all you're ever gonna want. However, it does have some disadvantages. For example, it's drawing 330 watts right now versus 220, so that's certainly something to think about. Some people are gonna care about that, some people won't, but it's certainly something to think about. And then there's also, you know, situations where you're not using ray tracing, which I think is still the most common situation in gaming, where it does offer a noticeable performance advantage, right? So that's certainly good. But how much of a performance advantage, right? So we can see like 25% there. Let's see, Cyberpunk can even go up into the 30% and over range. We can see, you know, 28% in Baldur's Gate at 4K. At, you know, 1440p Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, we're seeing like 20%, grows to 29% at 4K. In Starfield, we can see, you know, 28% at 1440p Ultra, 40% at the 4K settings. In our Unreal Engine 5 testing, Lords of the Fallen was basically a tie. In RoboCop, we're seeing a 17% lead. In, let's see, in Immortals of Aveum, more like a 20-ish% lead. So the point is, generally, when you're not ray tracing, you're taking somewhere between a, you know, 15 and 40% lead, with I think more common results being 25%-ish. But again, it's frequently less or more than that, depending on the specific game you're testing. But then you get into the fact that, but there's a price difference, right? So the official price cut article I saw was claiming $749, but actual pricing closer to $710. So if we look at the $710 pricing, like I said at the beginning of the video, you are paying 18% more money. And if you're getting like 25%-ish more performance in a lot of situations, and sometimes less, I don't know how exciting that is, given the fact that, you know, the card does have some disadvantages. Like I said, it draws a lot more power, and in heavy ray tracing workloads, which again, I don't think are super common at this point because console games aren't capable of it, but in heavy ray tracing workloads, you can still take a major loss, where the 4070 Super honestly is a bit weak for that level of ray tracing, but it's arguably usable, depending on what you're looking for, right? But again, it is still a disadvantage for the 7900 XT. And then there is the upscaling differences, where again, the 4070 Super, when upscaling, will look better than the 7900 XT will when it's upscaling. Although the 7900 XT has enough additional performance, especially when you're not ray tracing, that I think you would just be less likely to need or want to upscale. Like, let's look at Starfield, for example. 88 FPS, maxed out 1440p settings on the 7900 XT, which means I'm probably not gonna turn on upscaling. Whereas the 4070 Super hitting 69 is still very good. This is a first-person shooter style RPG. To me, in first-person shooter style games, I prefer to have an 80 to 90 FPS performance range. So in other words, on the 4070 Super, I might be more likely to need or want to upscale, whereas on the 7900 XT, I frequently won't. Although I think as, you know, time goes on and games get more demanding, I think you'll be more likely to want to upscale over time. So that's another thing to think about. But currently, at least, again, I think the raw performance means we're less likely to need to. Because again, like games like, you know, RoboCop Rogue City at 1440p Epic. Again, a similar situation, we're seeing like 81 versus 69. So it's like, you know, I just might not do the upscale, right? Might not need it. So if we don't need the upscaling, then maybe that's not too relevant. Although keep in mind that we're seeing games like Lords of the Fallen, Unreal Engine 5 game, pretty heavy duty. Where's my 1440p result? There it is. Where neither GPU is actually breaking 60 frames per second at 1440p Ultra, and we're seeing Unreal Engine games respond really well to that upscaling, right? We jump performance quite a bit, and then there is that bit of an image quality advantage to DLSS. This video is not really about the image quality differences, but I'll mention if you want to see some of it through YouTube compression, because a lot of it's in the really fine details. The RoboCop Rogue City example, I think, is one of the more obvious ones to look at. Well, you see the street is very shimmery, the car grille is very unstable. If you look at some of the fence line details as this goes a little bit further on, you know, this car's a bit unstable, that's a bit unstable in the background. So some of those stability things, if you look at the avatar results, I think the best place to look for some of the details is these fencing grills, especially the ones in the far distance as the camera rounds the corner. You'll just see that the FSR image is a bit less stable on those. Anyway, so that is an advantage, right? So for DLSS. So I guess what I'm getting at here is if you're going to charge 18% more money, you have to justify it, right? And in just raw rasterized performance, it does justify it. And then some in most cases, although, you know, some of them it's just about an even scaling. But with that even scaling, you then do have the other things kind of, you know, you got your pros and cons list, right? Like the energy consumption, like the upscaling, and then the heavy duty ray tracing performance. So how much you factor all of those other things into it is going to, versus the, you know, the big advantage in the, you know, 20 gigabytes of VRAM versus 12, which I think is, you know, the heaviest hitting hardware difference between the two. I think is going to bring a lot of people into different points on whether they think it would make sense to spend the additional money on the 7900 XT. So with that in mind, you know, I'm not sure I would solidly recommend the 7900 XT as worth the additional price. I think if they were closer in price, I would more easily recommend it over the 4070 Super. If for example, what if it was 650, right? If it was 650, I feel like we're, you know, basically in the same price class, right? And now, you know, you're paying 8% more money. And so you're often delivering much better than 8% advantage in rasterized performance. And now when we're basically tied in ray tracing performance, it's not as big of a deal because, you know, it's you know, you didn't pay that much more money anyway. And then you still got to deal with the, you know, the upscaling differences and things like that. So I think if AMD wanted these to fly off the shelves, I think 650 would be kind of a no-brainer, other than people who are definitely going to be just like ray tracing and upscaling all the time, which is certainly, you know, a thing. Anyway, I think at 710 or especially 750, I'm just less convinced that this is going to be for everybody. I still think for some people this does make more sense to spend the extra money, but I think it's just less of just a kind of a no-brainer, if that makes sense. Anyway, what do you guys think in the comments section? I'm really curious about it, because again, they don't cost the same, and that's what makes these comparisons more difficult, because I do think I would rather have the 7900 XT, but is it worth 18% more money? That's the question, right? I want to know you guys, your thoughts in the comment section, and I hope all of you have an excellent day, and huge thank you to subscribers, viewers, and especially channel members who have directly supported the channel financially through clicking the join button. That just, honestly, it's awesome to get the support, and when I'm running this many tests on this many games and this many GPUs, it's nice to get that little extra motivation of people, you know, showing the support and all that. So huge thank you to everybody, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.